Welcome, everybody. I'm Michelle Zabel, and I am the Executive Director of Innovations Institute at the UConn School of Social Work. And we're just thrilled to be here with our colleagues from Youth Move National. I'm going to introduce them in a second, but I just wanted to come on and thank you all for the roles that you're playing, leading systems in your own states, and really, ask you to promote this opportunity within your own communities. Somewhere, somebody in every single state that you reside in is doing crisis design work right now. The impetus of 988 and the funding that's become available to design and create a continuum of crisis response is being taken advantage of everywhere. And what we see from our seat is that although we are talking a bit about youth being part of the conversation about youth leadership having voice in this process, it's not quite playing out actually. So as we work across the country and work on helping states design, we turn to Youth Move National, who we have been long-term partners from. And if any of you don't know Youth Move National, please go to their website, learn about them. I'm sure Joshua and Shayn will do some describing, but they are dear partners to innovations. And when we came to them and said, I think we need to partner and do something about this issue of youth not being at the table in design, development, and implementation, they jumped right on it. So this 5-part series that's going to happen on Thursdays, the third Thursday, I think, right, of the month, the last Thursday of the month, from 2 to 3:30 Eastern time, is really set up to give you all as participants tools to go back into your own communities and be voices and advocates and disruptors in some situations to actually get youth leadership in your own state to the table. We're asking you to spread the word. We're asking you to bring your state leadership, to bring your youth leaders, to start a different conversation so that youth voices included all along the way. So I'm going to get off screen and turn it over to the real experts here, my colleagues, I screwed it up, Joshua. Calarino and Shayn McDonald, and they're going to tell you all about themselves. And again, please spread the word. We want this to be a shift and a change in how design is looking for mobile response and crisis systems across the country. So there you go. Take it away, guys.
All right, I'll go first. I know Josh, you're setting up. So hello, everyone. My name is Shayn McDonald. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. And I'm a youth program specialist with the team at Youth Move National. I'm located in Massachusetts. I am both queer and trans, as well as a trauma survivor with roots in direct peer support and youth-run peer program development, as well as within the overall recovery movement. I'm also a person with lived experience of navigating mental health crises myself, and crisis services as a young adult, and I'm so grateful to be here. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Josh.
Thanks, Shayn. Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Calarino, and I use he, him, his pronouns. I work as a youth program coordinator here at Youth Move National, where I'm calling out of today, Miami, Florida. Like Shayn, I also have my own lived experience navigating the system of care, specifically the mental health system of care. I've worked as a peer specialist, youth peer specialist, a peer evaluator. I've worked with multiple different organizations. I've been a consultant for SAMHSA. I've done a lot of work in the field having to do with our cross-cutting systems. And you could say that the culmination of my work, so to speak, I guess, is I won the Young Adult Youth Leadership Voice Award from SAMHSA. I believe that would have been around sometime around 2016. I'm just very excited to be here. With that being said, I imagine for those who don't know us, you'd like to know who we are. Well, like was mentioned earlier, we're from Youth Move National. MOVE is an acronym for Motivating Others Through Voices of Experience. And what we are, more specifically, is we are a youth-driven, chapter-based organization dedicated to improving service and systems that serve and support youth and young adults. And you might see that youth driven there is highlighted, so to speak. And just to give a brief inventory is we have a board of directors, and that board of directors is mandated, required to have at least a 60% representation of youth on that board. So we have a definition for what constitutes a youth. Generally speaking, we use 29 and under. Anything above that would be considered an adult. So any adult on our board is outnumbered, and we do that specifically. And what we try to do is practice kind of what we preach here. So everything that you'll see reflected in this presentation today does stem from our experience within this work, and something that we reflect up to our board of directors as well. So just for a little bit more context, Youth Move is a national youth org. What we do is we unite the voices of individuals who have lived experience across systems. So that includes the mental health system, juvenile justice system, child welfare, education, and just other systems that are actively working with youth. And the what of what we do is that we connect, support, and develop youth leadership and advocacy to create positive change. We practice in authentic youth engagement through youth-driven decision-making by elevating youth voices of lived experience. We ensure that young people are heard and valued as leaders in agencies, communities, and systems that impact their lives. And that leads us to why we do it. And Youth Move National envisions a future in which young people are valued as empowered leaders and advocates and designers of communities that are built for all youth to thrive. In the systems of care as they are right now, we have found that while sometimes effective, other times they're not so effective and potentially even harmful, as in my own lived experience, and potentially even in Shayn's lived experience and many other youth. And having their voices involved mitigates that happening and improves the systems from the ground up. So that then begs the question, how can that be done? How can we engage youth? Well, you don't need to worry about that, because we're actually going to go over the foundations of youth engagement. Okay. Youth engagement is a strategy in which youth are given meaningful voice and role and are authentically involved in working towards changing the systems that directly affect their lives. So, what is important in this definition we have here is those two highlighted at the end there: meaningful voice and role and authentically involved. Because oftentimes, and we're not going to go over it during this particular presentation. Oh, actually, I believe we do a little later, but we're going to go over the ladder of involvement, and you'll see what that looks like in particular. But a meaningful voice and role means that it actually means something. You don't just have the youth there to say that you have the youth there, but they're providing feedback. They understand what's going on. They have the knowledge. They have the leadership capacity. We have built these things for them, and they're actively and authentically involved in those changes. And we have a definition here for youth voice. Research shows patients and their families who actively engage for their health with care teams have better outcomes. They often choose less expensive options when participating in shared decision-making and express greater satisfaction with their healthcare experience. The Center for Advancing Health report on their Here to Stay, What Healthcare Leaders Say About Engagement. What engagement is that it is active. The healthcare system doesn't make engagement easy. Everyone benefits from engagement. That includes the youth, that includes their family, that includes all the staff and stakeholders and caretakers for the youth. Engagement is demanding, and many are unprepared, and partnerships are required through that process. So we have to be willing to partner with youth and see them as equal partners for it to be authentic and for it to be active and to actually reap those benefits. And the fact of the matter is that engagement is demanding. So you have to prepare for it. You have to think about simple things like the timing of our meetings, all the way up to more extensive things like how can we build policies, practices, and cultures in our system of care to be sure that the youth are able to actively engage. It can go from very simple to very complex very quickly. So to provide another view on what that might look like, we have Lofquist's spectrum of attitudes. And what this is oftentimes people use this as a tool to examine and describe adult and youth relationships. So to go through this, when considering youth participation in agency planning, operating, evaluations, there are 3 different styles that we can cycle through. Style 1 is that youth are objects. Style 2 is that youth are recipients. And style 3 is that youth are resources. In other words, things are done for youth. For example, things are at the agency are done for youth. We are essentially at that point looking at youth as objects, so to speak. We're talking about youth in planning meetings, not youth peers as hired staff. The objective is with youth as objects are that the personal growth of young people in practice. What happens there is that the adult is in control with no intention of actual youth involvement. And the byproduct of that is conformity of young people and acceptance of the program as it is. If you move to style 2, the objective is the same, but in practice, the adult is in control, but allows some youth involvement. And that has a byproduct of increased organizational effectiveness. And then we can move on to style 3. Objectives the same across all styles, but there is a youth and young adult partnership, which then allows for shared control. And the byproduct of that, while still having that increased organizational effectiveness, you also get the personal growth of young people and adults. And to provide a larger view of that, we have the objective, right? The what it looks like in practice, and then the byproduct for you all to see here. So as you're giving this a look, what we would appreciate is if you could maybe in the chat box, answer this question. What are some things you are doing for youth right now that we could instead be doing with youth? So to frame this within our spectrum, what are you doing right now with style 1 or even style 2 that you could be doing with style 3 on this spectrum? What are some things that we can do to bump along this continuum? I'm seeing George in the chat box saying research design. Very good. Love to see that. I'll give some time here for others to jump in and share as well. We would like to hear from the group. I see Barbara adding currently to creating a youth action board for homelessness, and with youth driving the recruitment of other youth and building their own board. So we can see how those 2 things are not exactly the same, yet similar. One of them is like, we're creating this, like it's gonna happen, we're gonna get it done. And the other one is youth are driving this process, which often leads to things like more buy-in and better outcomes. I'm seeing Nicole in the chat box as well saying, with an observation and reflection, even though the process were developed with youth, they aren't necessarily implemented with the same spirit. Yes, that is a key thing in the work that we're doing. We have to have youth involved at every single level. That nothing about nothing about us without us, there we go, mentality is not just we do a little bit of it and then another person will just filter it in. No, it's every single moment, every single second that we can have them involved, push it with them, have them edit it, have them change it. that spirit needs to be throughout the entire process. And I see one more here saying, we are creating materials to explain evaluation to youth, and we receive feedback on a video script we created, but have not done enough to ask them what information they think they need to understand the programs and data collection. Yes, an important point there is that just inviting youth into meetings isn't quite good enough. Youth need to have an understanding of what is going on. They need to have their leadership potential harnessed. It takes work. The example that I usually give is, if you just invite youth to be in the room, it's like handing a third grader a book on physics. And just like, all right, go do physics, just be a physicist. While you might have a really, really exceptional third grader who's might be able to do physics, that's likely to not happen. We need to put in the work to teach them their algebra and all of their other things to then be able to properly do that job, properly understand that material. So I see some more in the chat box. I'll take maybe one more, and please continue sharing, but I'm going to continue moving on. I see that Washington's age of consent is 13. So we work hard to engage youth and direct their own treatment. And I love that, that working with the youth, even at such a young age, is so vital to their development. With that, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but please feel free to continue sharing. And what I would like to move on to are the benefits that we can get from authentic youth engagement. So one of the benefits to start is that they can contribute to designing and implementation of new policies. And what that can look like is, back when I was just a member, or right when I was working as a lead peer with the Federation of Families Miami-Dade chapter, we actually heard some feedback from the youth after an evaluation subcommittee meeting brought up some issues. We did a focus group and we changed essentially the exiting policy for youth once their treatment, so to speak, was over. They felt like they were kind of just being dropped. Just like, all right, see you later. And they didn't like that. So we adapted and shifted what that looked like so the youth could feel more comfortable when leaving, and of course, ideally, have better outcomes. But it also contributes to that changes in the institutional culture and practice. Like we talked about, the system of care that we work in has to be receptive to youth culture. And that culture then shifts the practices, and those practices shifting can then be more effective and efficient in helping the youth that they're serving. But it also builds awareness and common understanding. The community is so vital to the work that we do, and having the full communities that we live in be aware and have a common understanding of the issues that youth are facing means that we can work quickly, we can work more effectively, we can get more done faster than we could otherwise. And it also builds a sense of community. Just like all people, youth tend to want to feel a part of something larger than themselves. Everyone wants to feel like something is larger than themselves and that they're a part of that. So we can build that into these communities like we're discussing. And then also build self-efficacy. I see, Barbara, actually at the same time, you actually mentioned that I think youth engagement intuitively builds self-efficacy. Yes, and as you said, it's so important in all areas of life, because the idea of what we're doing here is that once the youth are out of the system, they are self-efficient. They can do what they need to do, and ideally, we never see them in the system of care again. I always think about it as, you never want a nurse to say, see you later, when you're leaving the hospital. Ideally, you never have to show up there. I think it's the same for our system of care. And last but not least, improves individual and organizational outcomes. And when you think about it, the whole reason why we do this work is to have positive outcomes. All the time that we spend, all the money we spend, all of this is so that you can live and have and grow up into successful and wonderful lives. Now, when we're looking at this list of the benefits, This is including, but not limited to. There are certainly many more aspects that we can dive into, but this is just kind of a general, more comprehensive look. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen here, there are also some other links which you'll find in the presentation linked as well to see what else there is. And we're going to move on to that ladder that I mentioned earlier. So this is the ladder of youth involvement. If anyone's familiar, it came from Roger Hart. It came out, I want to say, around 1992. Something to keep in mind with this ladder is that oftentimes people use it as a tool. It's not a tool. What this is a conversation starter. These are something that you can use to think about and process the information of what youth involvement looks like within your organization. So there are a few rungs that we have on this ladder. The bottom three, we universally want to avoid, right? The best version of the bottom three is tokenism, and that is symbolic representation by a few that may not give genuine voice and may be asked to speak up for the group they represent. Not exactly great. But if we move just one rung above that, we have assigned but informed. Youth do not initiate, but they understand and have some sense of ownership. And I'm going to go ahead and move us all the way up to rung one. That is youth initiated and directed. And it is everything is designed and run by youth, and decisions are made by youth. Now, I think there's a bit of a common misconception here that we want everything to be at number one. Now, don't get me wrong, that is amazing. And when possible, absolutely number one is what we are looking for. But we have staff members and we have staff time, and there's a reason why the adults are there in these processes, and that is because youth sometimes also just have other things to do. They have work, they have school, they have other things that they need to be doing and being and places to be at. So there are going to be some facets of your organization that might not be all the way at the top rung, and might be where number three is, or rather, let's from the top down, it gets confusing, but where youth and adult initiated and directed is, or maybe even youth are just consulted and informed. Their youth might not have the time or capacity every second to be doing number one. So it can be important to think about that as you're moving through this ladder. What are the parts that we can have at rung one, and what capacity do youth have? And are there some parts that we might need to put them, or have them rather, not put them, right? We're working with, not doing things for youth, where we're gonna just initiate ourselves and make those shared decisions with them instead. So to provide an example of what that might look like, back when I was just joining my local youth chapter in Youth Blue Miami, I was going to school, I was having a really hard time, and I frankly just showed up to just go to what they offered. They offered a salsa class and some other stuff, and I wanted to be there. I was just not at the capacity to be at rung one. I had no knowledge, I had no experience. I was basically just some person off of the streets. But over time, they invested in my leadership potential. They sent me to trainings, they mentored me. I was coached by the peer specialist, and that brought me up to being able to be assigned and informed. And over time, I continued to grow and grow and grow as they invested in me as a youth leader, all the way up to where I became the vice president of that local chapter. And I can start working at that top rung where I was initiating everything and I was directing decisions. But we can work with youth to build into that where possible. Okay, that is the ladder of youth involvement. With that, we're going to talk about just some roles here. So these roles are based off of trauma-informed care. You can see those right at the bottom there with the arrow pointing in both directions. And there's on the top, we have inform, consult, involve, collaborate, empower, and in between, some examples of what that might look like. I do want to have a small discussion here, again, in the chat box. And it's around the question, where are these roles for youth and family in part of your previous answer? That question that we had initially, where are you fitting these roles in that vision? Do you want to add to your vision for the future right now? And is there anything that you might see on here that isn't part of your vision? Let me leave some time for that. And I do see some questions in the chat box. We will be having a Q&A a little later. I see Barbara currently at inform, but our goal is to make sure that they're at empower. Yeah, we want to get them into that right-hand side, maybe some strategy groups, steering committees, being a part of decision-making, and even being hired in staff or peer roles. Yes, I love that. Another bit that we can add to this, that we can ask and answer, is where have you seen youth and families engaged in your system? Where do you see that happening? See Barbara adding, we typically meet with the adults first. Yeah, just how onboarding happens. Yeah, that makes sense. But no, we can always try and build that more. I see George adding, we are starting an advisory group to collaborate. Yes, that's wonderful. A great way to engage youth is to start an advisory group, a youth advisory board, a committee, whatever that might look like. So with that, oh, I see one more, I'll add that in there. I see a HUD or HUD, I'm not sure what the acronym is for, has made it a requirement that youth be involved for the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project. So state jurisdictions have to have a youth action board. And I see that it stands for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Thank you very much. Another thing to add is acronyms and that kind of language and jargon that we use can sometimes be, I'll use the word othering, I guess, to youth. If they don't know the language, it can be difficult for them to be engaged. I appreciate all the feedback. Continue to keep sharing, but I'm going to move on to our next slide. So there are ways to improving the youth engagement process. And I'm just going to run through this here, and it can start with drafting a partnership description. We can build community partnerships to identify and engage youth participants. Building relationships and rapport is so important, from the staff to the youth, the peer to the youth, but also the youth amongst each other. Make an effort to understand and value the youth as individuals, right? They're not a monolith, they're their own individual people. And it can start with a simple, before you roll out into a meeting, is how are you all doing, right? We're still working with people, everyone. So it can be important to address them as such. You can provide information to youth regularly and in a timely manner. It is so important to be sure that if you're receiving feedback from youth, if you're stipending them and they're showing up and they're there the day of, that feedback goes somewhere, something happens, and they know what that something is. You want to provide support during in-person and virtual events. Allow them to ask questions, moderate panels, hold specific audience boundary and Q&A times, not dissimilar to the Q&A times that we're going to have at the end of this session. Engage multiple youth over time to provide diverse perspectives. Gather feedback from the youth to inform future partnerships. Do you think we should partner with this group, this organization? What do you want to see in our next partnership? These are questions you can ask. And then the last one on screen here, engage seasoned youth partners as mentors and peer leader. As the youth move along that ladder like we had earlier, there's no reason why we can't do a little bit of what we call Generation Next at Youth Move National and build the youth behind them as well. And then we're going to move on to here, addressing youth voice to increase best practice. So the first thing to do is to identify youth as a priority. Youth Move National's Best Practice Committee identified a need to understand what youth voice at agency and system levels are. You want to clarify what sorts of resources and commitments are required, prevent people from reinventing the wheel each time or causing distress or harm, provide a tailored and data-driven approach for developing, implementing, and advancing youth-driven activities. And a way to measure what that looks like are the why, vow, and why vote, which of course would beg the question, what are those things? We're going to have a presentation on this more deeply, but as a little intro, what it does is that it provides a framework of key indicators of meaningful and successful youth voice and program design on an agency level or a council. And thank you for dropping a link to that in the chat box, Shayn. What it does is that assessing then allows for a collective and reflective process to better understand where the agency or council is with engaging youth. The only way that we can improve at something is to know that we're maybe not so great at something in the first place. And this is a tool that can help you look at that. What it does is that it helps young people advocate for meaningful participation and support, and it just aids in assessing the impact of technical assistance that you may or may not be receiving at your organization. I'm going to move quickly now onto virtual engagement. When we're working with youth, and potentially even when we're working with youth in crisis, virtual engagement is a tool that we can use. And that goes over things like accessibility. Sometimes a youth is just not able to make it somewhere in person. For whatever reason it might be, it could be that they physically can't make it because of their geographical location. They're not comfortable with it. They don't feel safe. There's a million reasons. So virtual engagement can bridge that gap. Virtual is valuable. After this pandemic, we've all had to be virtual in one capacity or another, and we could just return to normal, or we can use these tools for those who it's worked well for and embed them into our systems. It also recognizes some limitations, and safety also looks different virtually. There are a couple of resources that once you receive this slide deck and links and all that after, you can look into. But there are tons of tools like Mural and Miro, Menti, Kahoot, Whiteboard. And there's a great idea here is that you can adapt activities to be fully virtual or even just be hybrid when possible. So we've laid our foundation for youth engagement. And I want everyone, when you're thinking back on what we've gone over, you can look at this through the lens of working with youth through crisis. All of these things are still applicable as you're navigating that process. But to be more specific and intentional around what that might look like, I'm going to turn the mic over to Shayn to take us through that instead.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. So now we're going to get into specific considerations around mobile response and stabilization services. And I definitely want y'all to keep everything that we just talked about in your minds and think about where these concepts could apply across each of these considerations. So first, I did kind of scroll through the participants. I don't know how many young people or folks that aren't actively involved in creating these systems we have in this space. But I do want to outline what we mean by this continuum and what's involved in that. So to break that down on the next slide here, the specifics of what mobile response and stabilization services look like is being determined by each state, including, of course, by folks within this very space. And these services look a bit different everywhere they are. However, there are three main components. And the first is where that initial reaching out happens, right? Those 24/7 crisis call or contact centers. The second piece is the mobile crisis response team, the folks that actually travel to the site of the crisis. And then the third piece is that ongoing care, or traditionally known as crisis receiving facilities, or my less favored term, stabilization programs. But this also includes community-based and in-home supports, which we're trying to shift and move towards, right? Essentially, phase 3 involves that ongoing network or system to support. Because as Joshua said, ideally, we don't want folks to end up back in a crisis and have to use these services. But in general, to have a network of supports out in their community, in their day-to-day, they feel comfortable exploring. is really important. So across each step of this continuum, I want y'all to think about what it means to meaningfully partner, as we've talked about it, with young people across their experience of crisis and navigation of these services. And I just got a few preambles before I dive into each of these phases. And first, I have a note about the needs of the family. So if we move on to this next one, thank you, Joshua. So throughout these conversations around mobile response and stabilization services, we've heard a lot about centering the needs of the family. And we need to think about this really intentionally. And apologies for folks that have heard me speak before. I speak on this a lot, but it's important. But in many cases, unfortunately, the needs of the family, right, tend to dissolve and clearly focus on serving the concerns, definitions, desires of the parent or caregiver, often over that young person in crisis. And it's absolutely real and valid that crisis situations for youth have a significant impact on the parent or caregiver or entire family unit, right? It's also understandable, right, that parents and caregivers want to reclaim that agency and autonomy from providers in a similar way that youth are advocating for. However, that doesn't mean the young person's voice, choice, and definition of crisis should be treated in any way as secondary. We've also heard a lot of concern in these discussions about youth declining treatment. While some may think of this as a problem, this is actually a great opportunity to connect and hear directly from youth in your communities. One assumption we can make is that if youth are declining treatment, it means the treatment's maybe not youth friendly, right? It can be on us, the adults, the designers, the implementers, the staffers, right? Why are young people declining these services? Are they concerned about police involvement? Will they miss school, prom, other extracurricular activities, right? Things like that. And another thing is, and I'll state this twice, if they can decline treatment, it also means they can consent to treatment. Again, we should also be working under the assumption that if youth can decline treatment, the youth can also consent to treatment. The question is, why are they declining treatment? So at the end of the day, we need to hear from the perspectives of young people first and foremost, before considering and separate from considering the perspectives of parents and caregivers. And whenever we use jargon or buzzwords and phrases, I think Joshua kind of noted this a little bit, but ensure you're able to clearly define and describe the words or actions within those phrases, right? So what does centering the needs of the family actually look like? What does that mean, right? What does that mean when we think about the age of consent to services, right? If parental or caregiver consent is not even required. What if you're working with a young adult whose family members are unsupportive of their identities and lived experiences, right? And if youth are able to consent or refuse treatment at a younger than 18 age of consent, I know somebody mentioned 13 even, do we have messaging and like direct to consumer marketing around that, right? Processes, policies, practices. Are we advertising directly to young people? Are we informing young people that they can access care and support even if their parent disagrees or vice versa, right? How do we be clear about our communication to parents and caregivers versus youth and young adults when we think about who might use these services? And if you have thoughts on that, feel free to add them to the chat, but this is kind of a broader question to percolate on and think about. So no worries if you don't have any like direct solutions to that in this moment, but definitely something to shift gears around. And to move a little bit further into this, ultimately, right, you should be supporting young people to speak up for themselves and do that self-advocacy across this process, right? Because this is their life, this is their crisis, and any steps forward is directly going to impact them first and foremost, right? So this includes supporting them with collaborating with others, right? We're speaking to partnership across this process, both as users of these services as well as designers. So successful collaboration is built on understanding the difference between positions and interests. And I think we got like a brief sneak peek, but we're here now. So position is what I want, right? It's the stance people and agencies or decision makers take, but unfortunately it provides little insight into their motivation. On the flip side, interest is why I want it. It explains the values, motives, and reasons for a given position. True resolution comes from understanding a person's reasons for why they want what they want, right? Knowing why can offer many options where all parties' needs can be met or addressed in some way versus the one solution approach that taking a position often limits people to. And it's important to understand that everyone's interests to reach a solution or it is important rather to understand everyone's interest to reach a solution that could work for everyone, while of course, again, always prioritizing the young person in the crisis. We want to remind any stakeholder in these conversations that the role of crisis response supports are not to be the negotiators for, as Joshua described earlier, the young person, but to teach that young person skills and collaborate with them so that they feel empowered to speak up and advocate for themselves. You can use your skills to encourage discussion that facilitates understanding so that a resolution can be reached, but ultimately really centering that young person's voice, interest, narrative of the situation and their desired approach to moving forward, right? And a little bit more about understanding interest, and the value of doing that on the next slide here. So seeking the why, right? The reason behind the position, right? Invites conversation for individuals to explore, again, the reasons why they want something. That sort of untold story, maybe, right? Listening and engaging in sincere dialogue respects the sharing process and demonstrates openness, which we really want, right? This means being open to learning a person's perspective and asking clarifying questions without imposing any narrative onto what they're communicating. This is especially important for adults and communicating with young people, whether you are like a natural support or a provider, right? Not trying to impose any narrative on that person, but really learn more from them where they're coming from, right? Consider solutions around everyone's interests again, instead of positions. The best consensus or resolution happens when people's needs are met, right? Sounds simple. And focusing solutions around interests leaves more room for compromise and consensus. And that doesn't mean compromise that young person's right to autonomy and self-determined care. But maybe if there's kind of a gap between the parent or caregiver interest, right, or position, and that young person's, it could, like, understanding interest and going about it in this way can kind of bridge that gap in a way that feels good to everybody, but again, prioritizes that young person. So by prioritizing and focusing on interest, we can work towards a mutually beneficial solution that addresses everyone's needs to some extent, while of course prioritizing the young person in crisis first and foremost. And another note that kind of goes back a little bit to centering the needs of the family, right? It's also important to consider how parent and caregiver positions and interests might not align with those of the young person going through the crisis and what that could mean. So, for example, it's a reality that the parent or caregiver could be contributing to the crisis itself. Like, that's real. Think about LGBTQ2S+ youth whose parents don't accept them. And that maybe bringing them to a place of crisis, or at the very least informing it, right? What are the consequences, or what could be the consequences of prioritizing those caregivers' definitions of the crisis and desired approaches to address it, right? Their position and interest. So while this information would be important to know, right, to give context, and there's absolutely an opportunity to support and educate that caregiver, we must not have that be a point of focus over that young person being impacted or influence the narrative of that crisis within itself. Awesome. Another little preamble here on the note of collective crisis, which is so important, especially as we are continuing through this pandemic. A lot of violence and restricting policies that are starting to permeate across different states. We really want to ask the following question, right? How are you holding space for young people to discuss and share their feelings about ongoing social issues that may be impacting them and that could bring them to a place of crisis or inform it, right? Young people are facing a lot of challenges related to these ongoing social and world issues, and that includes racism, queer and transphobia, violence at school shootings, right? Climate change, economic equality, and so much more. And as adults, right, it's important to hold intentional space for youth and young adults to discuss and share their feelings about these issues that may be impacting them and could understandably inform an experience of individual crisis. And by allowing young people to express themselves freely in a shared space and inform us about their lived experience, we can better understand the impact of these social issues and even some steps on how to move forward to address them. Right? It's not enough to simply talk about the issues themselves. We also need to address the root causes of these issues by talking about solutions to these systemic problems. And without systemic or greater level, right, solutions, we cannot expect to see a reduction in crises or even in rates of suicide. We must address those underlying issues that are causing these crises in the first place. So something to think about, as well as for folks working in mobile response and stabilization services. Keep this in mind when it comes to determining partnerships and collaborations, right? Your team doesn't have to solve these problems alone, and likely you can't, right? You're trying to develop all of these services specific to like serving individuals, right? But we're responsible for caring for the young people in our communities, so we need to come together around these larger issues affecting the population in general. It's also important to consider what messages you and any potential partners you have are sending around community and world issues, including what opportunities you're offering to youth to inform meaningful change around these issues. So all things to think about. We've got a couple more preambles here. The next one, it seems a little silly, but I found it to be really important. So this is just a little lens shaping opportunity specifically for the adults in this space, right? So I know as adults, we tend to feel a separation between us and the young people we seek to serve and support. And yes, it's important that we consider the nuances of supporting young people in comparison to adults, right? However, I want you to consider two things as I move through the rest of our content and really like thinking about all of these concepts that you see up on the screen here. So one, young people are human beings with real and valid living experiences that are happening right now, who deserve respect to each and every one of these values, regardless of their age. Now that might have to look a little bit different across age ranges, but all in all, this should be all of these sentiments should be incorporated across these processes. And two, and this one again might be a little silly, but it's important. If you have been privileged enough to become an adult, you have had firsthand lived experience of being a young person, right? And of course, it's important to channel the young people in your like current lives when considering how to implement these services, but try your best to think about what it may have been like for you, right? Channel into your own experience of having been a young person and what it may have been like for you to move through this continuum in a time of crisis. Really make it personal, because this is personal and can touch each and every one of us. So my last little preamble is on the terms that we use to describe each of these three phases of the continuum. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, created a guide of best practices for MRSS, and that is where the three phases of the continuum were termed: someone to call, someone to respond, and a safe place to be. But in further conversations, we want to consider a shift in language from SAMHSA someone to call to someone to contact. Again, understanding that text-based and virtual means of communication are essential, to enhancing access for youth outside of phone calls. Folks reach out in different ways, right? And phone calls are not necessarily the most ideal or popular among youth and young adults. We also want to consider shifting from a safe place to be to a system to support. The word safety is a really big one, right? And what that means for youth across lived identities and experiences can vastly differ. It also doesn't acknowledge the importance of an ongoing network of support with a focus on in-community, non-restrictive programs and resources, as opposed to locked inpatient psychiatric units and more restrictive environments. So you can access SAMHSA's best practice guide online. It was the culmination of a lot of conversations, both with providers, people with lived experience in these systems, as well as providers with lived experience, or peer providers, right, with lived experience in these systems. So there's a lot on there that can be valuable. And I think that the link is on the slide here itself. So when we send that out, folks should be able to access that. All right, so diving into the continuum. I know we're moving towards the end of our time here, but I'm going to keep it going. So when it comes to the first phase of someone to call, or even better, right, someone to contact, again, we want to prioritize youth-defined crisis. The reality or the belief that it's impossible to be heard and understood is often a big part of a young person's experience of crisis. And let's be honest, their experience of the world at large, right? Being present with and holding space for youth in crisis, even at this initial point of contact, should involve gauging their tolerance for and comfortability with others present or who may be called to be involved, as well as prioritizing their deconstruction and definition of the crisis and what that means to them, again, as we previously talked about. We also need to be transparent around any kind of tracking, right? Or lack of anonymity in this initial outreach to these call or text centers or online platforms that could get you that support, right? Young people have the right to know, a right to data privacy, and a right to just general privacy wherever possible. So really thinking about data ethics within your efforts, as well as any sort of tracking within your services themselves. And on the note of reaching out, we need to build infrastructure for multiple points of access, inclusive of, right, texting, online and social ways to ask for crisis support, as youth and young adults, again, don't always feel comfortable with a phone call. That's real. And again, in addition to their defining of the crisis, it's important to engage in active and reflective listening and dialogue with an emphasis on self-determination of any kind of ongoing engagement or support or next steps, right? It's important to lay out all of the options that a young person may have the potential to explore and really work to shape any next steps around their desires or their interests, right? As we talked about before. And finally, of course, providing opportunities for young people to connect with youth of similar lived experience, right? Their peers, including at this initial point of contact. So to those designing and staffing these services, recruit folks with firsthand lived experience to be on the other side of those calls or messages, at the very least, in addition and available to youth outside of any other trained responders. So I'm sure that there's a lot more we could say about this piece, but these are some considerations for this moment. And this is really in service of partnering with youth, utilizing these services as young people going through a crisis themselves. So now jump into phase 2, which is someone to respond. And this first point is a really big one. And I put a lot of weight on it, so I'm going to pause before I jump into it. Okay, so first and foremost, we emphasize the complete avoidance of police presence. Here's the hard truth, and I've said this in a previous conversation, but the mental health system grows alongside systems of oppression. Capitalism, white supremacy, imperialism all exist within its roots and continue to influence the system even now. And of course, these ideals disproportionately harm youth of color, LGBTQ2S+, and disabled youth. So in order to create an anti-oppressive or justice-oriented approach to mobile response and stabilization services, and this is true for all mental health and youth serving systems and services, right? They must also be anti-carceral. This means moving away from practices and protocols that have historically functioned to contain people, take away their agency and control, offer surveillance, isolate them from their communities, and ultimately limit their freedom. This also includes moving away from more restrictive treatment environments like locked psychiatric units with a focus on in-community supports, as well as moving away from involvement with an entity that could result in violence, incarceration, or even death, which is law enforcement. And now there's been this emergence of what's known as co-responder models, where mental health providers or social workers ride along with officers to the crisis, which is definitely a means of harm reduction. That's real. However, police presence being entirely absent unless absolutely necessary should always be the ideal, especially for youth with historically excluded identities, right? BIPOC, LGBTQ2S+, disabled youth, right? Interactions with police can be traumatizing and create greater risk for harm or worse. And the goal is to reduce the amount of trauma brought to an already traumatizing experience of being in crisis, right? In addition, and this is a little bit more nuanced, a little more abstract, right? Mobile response and stabilization service providers, system designers, and honestly, all of us need not only to unpack involvement with and reliance on the police and carceral institutions, including locked psychiatric units, but we must also delve into how we embody carceral logic ourselves, right? Where our concerns are coming from, where our fears are coming from, like if we're sort of directing them around this narrative, both in our work and in our everyday lives, right? It's important, I think, that there's this big argument or big concern about, replacing cops with social workers and them taking on a similar carceral or policing role. We want to make sure that we're letting go and shedding all of those things and making those shifts so that even if we are not utilizing law enforcement or involving a police presence, we're not mirroring those similar ways of engagement, if that makes sense. And again, shout out to peer involvement. We emphasize peer support as essential across this continuum. So specifically, youth peers with firsthand lived experience of moving through crisis should be an integral part of that response and on-site engagement with young people. Moving on to what helps with harms, which is actually a framework designed in partnership with youth that we use at Youth Move National to hold really intentional conversations with communities of different identities and experience to get meaningful feedback to inform meaningful change. But in this sense, it can also be a conversation in support of one individual to build a plan moving forward, right? So when working with a young person in crisis about next steps for moving forward, it's important to learn from them, right, about what may be most helpful and most harmful in the path ahead. This means people they want involved, right? Family, peers, current providers, etc. Places and settings they would feel comfortable exploring for further support. So maybe they've had experience with one organization, one therapist, one hospital, one outpatient program, whatever. Try to exclude places that young people have considered harmful or unhelpful. And even when it comes to engagement in any kind of treatment, right? What medications, tools, approaches have been helpful for that young person by their own definition, right? And what would they absolutely never want to be engaged with or prescribed ever again, right? Really work to plan for that next step in collaboration with you and in alignment with their desires and comfortability. And an amazing tool that I actually learned about very recently that I know has been helpful for adults, but to my knowledge hasn't been pulled into the youth sphere yet. I imagine around age of like consent laws and things like that. But it's what's known as a psychiatric advanced directive, or a PAD, which is a legal tool that allows a person with mental health experiences to state their preferences for treatment in advance of a crisis. These can serve as a way to protect a person's autonomy and ability to self-direct care. So I definitely encourage you to explore those more and think about how you could potentially incorporate them into youth services. Next is flexible location. So it's also important that these on-site crisis teams hold space for an initial conversation with the young person in a location where they feel comfortable and safe to be open and honest. This could mean in a specific room, outside the house, right? With certain people, maybe even caregivers outside of the room that they're speaking in, right? Things like that, and really trying to honor that. Gauging basic needs at this point can have a substantial impact as well, right? Many crises manifested in emotional distress originate in environmental stressors or just sort of outer contextual things going on in their lives, right? Such as lack of nutrition or access to food, lack of access to clothing, funds, or transportation, housing conditions, maybe even legal problems that might not even be impacting that individual young person directly, but their overall family unit, right? So gauging and addressing basic needs might involve mobilizing a person's, of course, desired natural support system, collaborating with them on problem solving, and even providing these material resources, right, such as food, clothing, or money, which can make a big impact pretty quickly. I will say also that bureaucratic obstacles also often contribute to crises, and support with navigating these big mazes, right, like healthcare, financial benefits, access to essential needs can go a long way. And finally, an emphasis on, and I will highlight just verbally the word adjacent, right? Guardian family adult supports. Caregivers and adults involved in a young person's crisis should absolutely also receive peer support and resources, but we emphasize that they should be distinct and separate from those resources and spaces provided to the young person themselves. So ensuring the parent, family, peer support and the youth peer support are provided individually or independently, but in tandem or in partnership, right? That way both parties get support from a peer with similar lived experience and no narrative overtakes the other. They're both held as valid and important, right? And then the last phase here, when it comes to a quote unquote safe place to be, or better, a system to support. So Joshua, if you could just flip on the next slide. Thank you. So a note about the word safety. This is a big sort of line I like to use everywhere that I talk about safety, right? It's important to remember that safety is never a promise or a guarantee. It's not, it can't be, but it is an active and an ongoing intention. So especially for young people with historically excluded identities, we need to consider what safety truly means to and by them, right? And how you can work to incorporate that. And again, one more shout out to peer involvement for this session, including safe spaces of respite. So youth in crisis may seek safe spaces of respite from harmful or traumatizing environments, which again, may have provoked or could sustain their state of being in a crisis. They might also just desire a space away from their day-to-day in general, which is also real and valid, right? So incorporating peer supports, both in any kind of inpatient and residential treatment settings, but also moving towards more peer-led respites, which I believe are only currently available for those 18 plus, is really essential to this ongoing system to support. And for those who are unaware, a peer respite is a voluntary short-term overnight program that provides community-based non-clinical crisis support entirely run by peers for peers. I myself, as I said, I'm in Massachusetts. And I believe that there are at least 2, if not 3 or more peer respites. They are for folks 18 plus. But again, I mean, looking at the possibilities of shifting these things that are so helpful to the adult sphere to the youth sphere, right? And on the flip side, from these more like restrictive settings that we're trying to steer away from, right? We want to emphasize a shift towards more in-home and in-community, less restrictive care, right? For many young people, removal from their home and communities as a means of stabilization is not ideal and can make their journeys of healing even more stressful than they already are, right? So if possible, opportunities for support within the home and within community-based non-restrictive programs should be available. And that, of course, includes youth peer support. Next piece here is informed consent to treatment, and that includes medication, any kind of indiscriminate use of medication and other means of forced treatment. You could say it's involuntary, but another word for that is absolutely forced treatment, right? Can undermine trust and interferes with the right of young people to self-determined, informed consent and overall care. We understand that there are like certain lines for that legally and like within their protocols, but in general, a shift to really making sure that any sort of step forward or path forward for that young person is something that they feel good about and they had a major part, or if not the lead in determining, right? And that includes not only for like just within the crisis itself, but in terms of any kind of continuity or ongoing level of care. So once a person has moved, a young person rather, has moved through that initial crisis, it's important that we offer resources and supports for ongoing care as they return to their day-to-day lives. A big piece of this reentry experience that was missing for me personally when I was in crisis as a young person was in transitioning back to school. I mean, like I got my homework delivered to me. They had a tutor that just kind of walked around and answered blanket level questions. But in terms of like keeping up with the curriculum and staying on track for when I returned to school, it really just was this gap. And once I returned, it was just sort of trying to run and catch up or falling behind and having that consequently affect my next year, right? So there are programs that have been created, these transition programs. There is one in Massachusetts. It's called BRYT. It's BRYT. I think it's like Building Resilience for Youth in Transition. It's not like my favorite name there, but I really like the service. So it's designed to provide supports to students returning to school, specifically after extended absence due to mental health experiences. So moving through crisis, right, is difficult enough, never mind being removed from our homes and communities as part of that. Without these re-entry or transitional supports, that puts a whole other level of stress and pressure on folks who have just maybe begun to heal from a profoundly difficult time in their lives. So really trying to think about that. And then finally, accessibility and responsiveness to intersectional identities and experiences. And I feel like there's been a pretty massive shift in this language universally where I've seen it, but I do want to add a note and emphasize the term cultural responsiveness, right? As we've talked about these buzz phrases, and steer clear of anything along the lines of cultural competency. It's impossible to be fully competent in cultures and identities outside of the ones that we hold, whereas crisis responders, service providers, and systems can be considerate and informed of cultural context and interpretation in their response to members of those cultures, especially those who have been historically excluded. This is also where it's important to staff these services with members whose identities and experiences are reflective of their communities. So before we kind of wrap up with some resources and move on to discussion, I just have some like last few pieces to close out this discussion with additional considerations. So we've talked a bit about transparency around tracking when it comes to crisis contact centers, but it's also important to ensure confidentiality as much as possible across the board, as well as thinking intentionally around data justice within MRSS as these services are operating and data is being collected and analyzed. I think that was something that was mentioned in the chat as well that folks were thinking about in terms of doing with youth, which is awesome. We also understand that, oh my goodness, clearly I'm towards the end here, y'all. We also understand that specific populations have specific needs. That doesn't just mean youth in comparison to adults, but across different geographic locations, communities, identities, and experiences, including across systems. So on the note of collective crisis response, it's also important these conversations happen across youth serving systems in addition to mental health. So juvenile justice, child welfare, special education, etc. And we'll get more into what it means to be trauma informed and to hold trauma informed principles in a later session. But we ask that you start to reflect on how this is being thought about in the design and improvement of these services, right? We talked about buzzwords and jargon, and trauma informed seems to be becoming a little bit more of the same. It's a box you must check off, right? But what does that actually mean within these services? And what ways are these principles incorporated and emphasized? And I'm sure we'll ask more of these questions like directly to y'all in future sessions, but something to percolate on for the moment in the meantime. So in general, in today's session, we talked about what it means to meaningfully partner with youth who are utilizing mobile response and stabilization services, with some notes about youth maybe informing the process. But in our next session, we're going to deep dive into what it means to meaningfully partner with youth in designing these services, from development to implementation, and even to continuous quality improvement. And this will be a lot more helpful when y'all can actually click around and explore these as you dive into your portal or wherever this slide deck lives. But we do have some wrap up and resources and just sort of like an end question to think about. I think Joshua did ask this earlier, but again, just re-asking this question of what are some things you can do to meaningfully shift towards that doing with level engagement with young people across these services, right? And if you're a young person yourself, I don't know if we have any young people in this space, but if you are a young person yourself, how do you feel about the level of engagement you've had with this effort? Whether or not you've engaged with these services before, it's something that might absolutely impact you at some point. So how have your contributions been implemented if you have been a part of these conversations, or what opportunities or invitations have you had to be a part of these conversations? So we have a lot of resources that were like co-designed with youth and other youth serving organizations. So these were all, I think many of these are through Youth Move National. We do have Heart's Ladder of Youth Engagement with examples if folks are still a little bit flustered on the difference between those rungs. And then the next page of resources are all around specifically MRSS. It includes that SAMHSA guide for best practices, as well as an opportunity to join a learning community around this topic. So with that, I believe I'm passing it back to our friends at UConn to kick off some discussion.
So this is Denise. Thank you, Joshua and Shane. That was amazing. And Joshua, do you mind just going back one slide for 1 second to the resources? Yes, that first resource, the Mobile Response and Stabilization National Best Practices, those were developed by the Quality Learning Collaborative that we're running in partnership with Youth Move National. So if you want to take a peek at those new and the best of the best practices, please click on that link. And that learning community is one that we recorded in partnership with NASHBIT. Liz Manley chaired and hosted that series, and that's available to access at your convenience. So we have a few questions. There was some discussion and excitement about the YVAL. So little commercial for everyone. Please mark your calendars for July 27th. Again, at 2 o'clock Eastern time, where we'll do a deeper dive into the YVAL. But Lee's comment about this is, what are some ways to hold states and provider agencies accountable to their promises to include youth voice in their system? The assessment tool sounds promising, but how are we holding them accountable?
I can go ahead and take that one. So I was leaving some space in there. So I'm sorry, you asked the assessment still comes from, and how are we holding stakeholders accountable?
Yes. Yeah.
Got it. There's a number of ways to do that, frankly. I mean, if you want me to do it the easy way, oftentimes what I have found is that youth, generally speaking, don't have a great through line for something like a complaint, but being able to receive these complaints and have them come in and maintaining a process like that and telling youth to, if you're having issues, right, people need to know. I think it kind of can begin with making sure that the youth are vocalizing their own concerns. Now, that can be difficult to do, as in there are some systems of care where that process isn't quite embedded just yet, so it can be difficult. To provide an example of what that looks like is back when I was working at the Federation of Families. I was the lead peer for the agency, and the youth were having some trouble with the system of care. They were having trouble with the therapists, and like there were these like wild situations that they were running into. And we had spoken with the evaluation team, and we tried, and like it just nothing was working. So what the youth actually ended up doing is they got the idea to create a video. And this video, you can find it on YouTube. At Youth Move Miami, we created a video called Therapists Be Like. And it was an entirely youth-driven process. We opened up our center on the weekends. They did all the recording. They wrote the lines. They wrote the script. They were the directors. They did the camera work, all of that stuff. And we created this video. And they created a hashtag, and we launched a campaign based on this video called hashtag Therapists Be Like. And we presented that video to the program and evaluation subcommittee meetings of that grant. And, you know, it ruffled some feathers. Some people were upset, but essentially asked that for saying, you can get mad at us all you want, but like the youth are the one that made this. Like they're the ones that are saying this. I'm not saying anything. The youth are clearly having issues. And despite the number of times they've tried to vocalize it, and I can try and find the link to videos, and every time they try to vocalize it, it's gotten nowhere. So it can sometimes be going through the proper channels, and it can oftentimes be allowing the youth to be creative and pushing them to voice their concerns. But that's, you know, that's a tall order. Ideally, you can present these issues at meetings. You can push your stakeholders to make these necessary changes. And the idea is the more you can embed proper youth voice, hearing it from the youth themselves, I have found the more buy-in you get from stakeholders who can then push for those changes. I hope that answers your question.
Amazing response. And yes, if you could find that link about therapists that you'd like, that would be amazing to share as well. I'm going to hand it off and ask Liz to come off mute. She has a couple of questions for you.
I do have, this is Liz Manley, and I'm really happy to join you. I always appreciate Shayn's presentations, and Joshua, you were really terrific today and helpful in, I think, for a couple of reasons. And one of the things I did want to say, just in your response to how do you get people to listen to young people, that is exactly how you get people to listen. And my experience is that when young people are present in the room, they get the most time, the most attention, and their the information that young people share is generally what the adults or professionals take away from a conference, from a meeting, from a policy conversation. I could be in the room with folks in New Jersey as the assistant commissioner and not be heard, but the young people around me were always heard. So it's really powerful, your message. But today you talked about the use of law enforcement, and I always like to go back to this use of law enforcement to help our partners really put it all in context. And what I hear a lot from folks around the country, in particular in more rural and frontier areas, is they can't get mental health professionals in those communities quite yet. And so they think about using law enforcement as that first go-to. But we have worries about that. And Shayn, I think you were clearly articulating the point of view of young people who might have had a negative experience, or, so I'm wondering if there is a way for us to message to folks. Is there a way that can even be a helpful intervention? Or do we really need to say, let's just try something else?
I mean, I personally would say that there isn't a benefit to having any kind of involvement. I will say that it's not always a possibility to not have any kind of involvement, especially like I had in a previous conversation, somebody was like, I'm in a really rural area, or like we kind of can't not have ties, because if there is a need for like, more intensive intervention or something, or a police presence, and they would have to travel a long way, and that could, but in general, what I found is that I need to find the specific name of it. I want to say like Cahoots or Kahoot. Yeah, I know that there have been efforts to address crises without police presence, and even in these cases or through these services, they found that like very, very minimal like statistics of when they needed to reach out for additional support from police or law enforcement. So I think that like in general, it's about developing relationships with your local law enforcement, really like promoting the benefits of approaching these services in this way. And then showing the statistics of folks that are actively doing it and showing that like the risk is so minimal, right? And then yeah, really trying to continue to move towards that. But we understand that not everybody can necessarily get there today or right now or tomorrow, right? But that's a general just sort of like theme that we're trying to shift and really promote within these conversations.
Yeah, it's really helpful to just ground folks and let folks know. And I can just tell you, New Jersey's data is that it's like 0.1% of the calls, right? So it's not even a percentage. And so, but there's a ton of work that has to get done in the upfront. So it's really helpful just to continue to hear your voice, letting folks know why this work is so incredibly important. I also wanted to ask you and Joshua both around language, right? So, you know, I am not one of those young people on the call, and I'm one of the people who were trained a long, long time ago, and so sometimes trip over language. So it's really always helpful to have us grounded in language because we also know how important language is. So my question is are there words that we should just get rid of, right? Just say, let's not use them. I know kiddo is one of them. So are there other words that we could just make sure that get on people's radar around language?
I don't think I'd be able to give you a full list. I need to like go back and percolate on it. But I know one of the big things I said was like stabilization. I think it takes a lot of the humanity away from that young person going through a really meaningful experience, right? You need to be stabilized. You are unstable. That also implies that like our concern around your experience is your threat to society, right? And not like what could actually be helpful to you and what you're going through, right? And the validity of that within itself. So I think that's a huge one that's just like first and foremost in my mind. There's another term that can be used legally to describe a young person who is not going along with their parent or caregiver's guidance or directives. It's called like incorrigible youth. And I think that also implies that like, oh, young person's a threat to society because they're not obeying adults, right? But that's not serving what we're saying here, which is that they should absolutely be at the forefront of informing these efforts and making decisions for, on behalf of their own lives. So, I don't know. Those are like the phrases of the week. I think that I'd get rid of. Joshua, go ahead.
And maybe as we continue this conversation over the next couple of months, it would be helpful, I think, if you can help always ground set on some of those words that we definitely want to move away from, recognizing that some of us were trained a long, long time ago. So one other question I have is, what are your thoughts on emergency services like, emergency personnel and fire responses? Do you have the same thoughts about those type of responses as you do around law enforcement?
I can go ahead and jump in for this one. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is law enforcement. There's a lot of negative connotations to that. And then we can cycle in EMS, but where I feel, and it could just be me, is that frankly, law enforcement already has a job to do, and EMS, they kind of already also have a job to do. So the way that I see it is if we can somehow embed like a third one that would be specific to this kind of issue, I feel like it would help maybe bridge that gap. So if there could be like a peer on hand or something like that. Because we can always find, I feel like we can always find these like, we can just toss it over here, we can toss it over there, or we can maybe create something a little more organic is how I see it.
That's wonderful. I really like the way that you're thinking about that. It's really helpful in systems design, right? And trying to figure it all out.
Okay, I was going to add too that like not throwing in, but involving peers across any kind of system that might actively engage youth is huge. So like having peers involved, right, maybe in fire response or EMS, right, can be helpful. But I think just again along that line of like anti-carceral care, if there's any kind of any part of these services that are designed to or just consequently end up taking power away from people and pulling them away from their communities, really trying to, obviously like a hospital, like if you need to go to a hospital for medical care, that it's kind of a line there. And if there's a fire in your home, then obviously you need to relocate, but things like that, you can still kind of take into consideration some of its nuance across different systems. So go ahead, Josh.
Makes perfect sense. Joshua, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly just jump in for the thought around language, and I'll give a short version. The thing is that language is really powerful, right? They said the pen is mightier than the sword, the voice is mightier than whatever other weapon you want to put in. But what I'm trying to get at is that language is really important, but it varies from person to person. So what can often be the easiest thing to do is, again, to just ask the youth. It can be really important to just ask, like, when I'm referring to whatever it might be, what is the best way to do that around you? What would you say? And I think another thing that happens in system of care is that we take really complex things and then we break them down into one word description. So if you had to have me choose a word, I believe the word is non-compliant. Now, I get it. Sometimes people are quote unquote non-compliant, but then it's kind of like what we talked about at the top of the training. What does that mean? What does non-compliant mean? Is it that you're tying the youth down onto a bed and they don't want that? That just sounds less like non-compliant and more like, I don't think anybody wants that. So it just, you see how, what I mean, like, sometimes you need more words to have more context. So language can sometimes be a little bit too simplifying.
I do agree with you wholeheartedly. And I just want to also make a comment about language and just saying that I agree with the non-compliant. It's words that I got rid of in my own vocabulary quite a long time ago. And I think that there are ways for us to be clearer in our language and use common words to get there. So really helpful if you could continue to help sort of feed the field around that. That would be one of my asks. Shayn, one more question for you before we wrap up, and that is, you talked about the advanced directive, right? Which I totally agree with you that it's a really good strategy, but I was wondering if you had thoughts about how that's used and how that's communicated in advance, or have you seen like some best practice ideas about the guidance around that, or is that something we should explore a little bit more on?
That's something that I need to explore a little bit more on, because like I said, I think it was literally this week that somebody shared within our like internal communications that they were seeking out youth input about, like from folks that have had experience with this. I mean, youth, they said that likely it would be 18 plus, but if it is in certain states available to folks younger, like we want you to speak to it. So this is all new to me. In terms of like what's included, I'm sorry, about what, like when these things are used, I think it's sort of like predetermined with your network of supports, both like professional and personal. And then, you know, if you reach a stage of, you know, a place of crisis, it's sort of like provides tangible guidance. It even, I think, has some like legal weight to it, where you know, if there are specific hospitals, or like if you don't want like ECT, right, or you don't want to be in a place where there's seclusion and restraint, right, or, you know, things like that, all of these things. And I will say too that I have heard that the RAP plans, the Wellness Recovery Action Plannings, in some states, you can actually get those notarized in a similar way, and they can act basically as this. So all of these things as ways for young people to advocate for themselves, and especially like if they designate somebody, if for whatever reason they are not in a place where like they can make decisions for themselves or whatever, they have a trusted individual with a set of guidelines about what they would or would not want within this circumstance that could be held to. So
I think it's wonderful. It's great that you brought that up, and I think it's really important for us to continue to explore and try to figure out where that best practice is going to land for everybody engaged. But I appreciate you answering all of my questions. It's really been wonderful, and I'm going to hand back to Denise since you've done a great job answering mine.
No, this has been fabulous. I think we have a few more slides so folks can follow you. Let's see what we have next here.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And I can go ahead and take this one. Hello, everyone. This is our social media for Youth Move National. You can find us on Facebook, you can find us on Instagram, find us on Twitter. But also, I think a really big resource that people don't tend to use is our website. our website, youthmovnational.org, we have publications, we have consulting packages, we have a ton of stuff that can be used. Some are paid, most are free, that can be really helpful throughout this process. Topics like strategic sharing, creating a youth advisory board, the youth spectrum from the 7 stages, all of these things are available if you just stop by our website and give it a little look-see. Please follow us on social media. You can also find our mailing list on our website as well.
That was fabulous. You know, we need voice actors, Joshua. You might want to apply for one of those. I think the next one has our social media, so please follow us at UConn. Did it not? Oh, there it is at the bottom. Yeah. Our website, those of you that know us know that we moved from the University of Maryland to the University of Connecticut. Today is our 90th day in our new home. So our website is under construction and it's going to be up soon. But please also follow us on social media and mark your calendars, and please come back on April 27th for part 2 of engagement and partnership. And thank you so much, Joshua and Shayn. I'm really looking forward to the rest of this series. You two are both tremendous partners. We appreciate you.
Thanks, y'all. Sorry, we're bopping around for links for somebody.
Look at that. That's fabulous. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for joining this month's Learning Community session. Please take a few moments to complete the evaluation for this session using the following link being posted in the chat. We will be providing a certificate of attendance after completion of each session offered throughout the entire Learning Community series. Please make sure that you are registered with the same name that you used to log into each session so that we can confirm your attendance and the total time you were a part of each session. Please allow up to 10 business days for your certificate of attendance to become available in the Innovations LMS. Any presentations, resources, and recordings will be made available to you within the Innovations LMS. Once you are registered for the Learning Community, you will have access to all the upcoming and previously recorded sessions. We hope you join us again for next month's Learning Community session. You can access the Zoom link for each session and download a calendar appointment for that session by logging into the Innovations LMS, access the Learning Community curriculum, and click the View button for the upcoming session.